Hi, this is Dustin Hausner. I am the Jewish Outreach and Program Director at the Wayne YMCA. All our Jewish programs is funded by the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. So today I have a very interesting guest I'm really excited to talk to. Today we're speaking with Dr. Mitchell G. Bard, who is the Curator, Executive Director, and Founder of the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise. Among one of its many things that it works on, it works on the Jewish Virtual Library as a very wonderful online resource. So I would like this opportunity to welcome Dr. Mitchell Bard. Dr. Mitchell, it's wonderful to have you here.
Good to be with you.
Excellent. So before we get started talking about the organization that obviously you are part of and helped found, I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about yourself for those who are unfamiliar about who you are and a little bit about your background.
Well, grew up in California, went to 4 different universities of California collecting useless degrees. Having gotten a PhD in political science, it seemed like Washington was the place to be, so I moved here. And I worked in my first real job at APAC for a little over 3 years, the editor of the Near East Report, their newsletter, and then founded the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise in 1993 and been running it ever since. In my spare time, I write books.
Very nice. So I definitely want to find out a little bit more about some of the books that you've written as well. But I'm curious, what made you decide to create this enterprise of the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise? So what made you decide to create?
You can call it ACE. It's less of a mouthful.
Fair enough.
The genesis really came while I was at APAC, when I came to the conclusion that the old arguments that we traditionally made for supporting Israel weren't as effective as they used to be. That is, we used to generally tend to say Israel's a small country, it needs America's help, and sort of was portrayed as always having its hand out. And I argued that Israel had a lot to offer America. And so I began to look at what I called shared value initiatives to try to explain to the American people that, and to elected officials, that Israel had a lot to offer us. And so when ACE began, we started by doing a number of different kinds of studies about ways that America could learn from Israeli innovations in education and biotechnology and care for the elderly, things like that.
So what kind of initiatives, I would say, since 1993, I mean, again, we'll talk about the Jewish Virtual Library shortly, but I was curious, what type of initiatives and work have you done since its founding?
Well, we've evolved over time and done a variety of different things. Probably the most influential project we did for about 8 years, we brought more than 100 Israeli professors to teach at about 70 American universities from 1 to 3 years. And during that time, they completely changed the nature of Israel studies in America, because prior to that time, we started in about 2006, there was very little about Israel that you could find at most major universities. There were relatively few courses. There were only 2 or 3 centers of Israel studies. And our goal was to try to spread that and to show Americans that the Israel studies wasn't just about studying the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinians, that Israel was a much more interesting place where you could study its literature, its culture, its history, agriculture, archaeology, the whole gambit. And by looking at Israel through the variety of prisms, you would have a much broader and, I think, accurate understanding of Israel. And as a result of those professors coming, they were so successful that a number of universities subsequently created centers of Israel studies at places like Maryland, UCLA, or if not centers, they would have chairs in Israel studies at places like San Francisco State and Ohio State. So since we ran that project for about 8 years, Israel studies as a discipline in the United States has really exploded, and you can find exponentially more courses than you used to be able to find, and some very, very good programs.
I mean, it sounds like a huge part of obviously your work and kind of your mission was this idea of expanding the knowledge of education when it comes to Israel outside of kind of this simple binary of what many people think of a first assumption when it comes to necessarily the conflicts or like as you said originally of Israel is a small nation that needs Americans. So it's about kind of expanding to the idea of what the character and what is Israel as a whole picture.
Really, it's studying Israel the way you normally study every other country. And probably my greatest triumph, you could say, or the place I'm most proud of is one of my alma maters, which is Berkeley. For many years, and even today, Berkeley has typically been one of the most anti-Israel campuses in the country. And today, it has probably the most robust programs in Israel studies in the country, which really was an outgrowth of a visiting professor that we had at Berkeley just about the time it had the first student government resolution calling for divestment from companies doing business in Israel. And that resolution ended up being defeated. And from that point on, even while they're the usual nudniks, the Israel Studies program has become extremely popular and extremely successful with a number of visiting and permanent professors and all sorts of lectures and cultural activities. And it's really become a model for what you can do with Israel Studies.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful legacy of work that you've been able to do, obviously bringing these professors in and kind of expanding the scope of the knowledge and how to really look into Israel, as you said, just as you would with any other country. I'm curious because you kind of mentioned a couple of different things. You mentioned obviously the history of Israel. You mentioned obviously the BDS movement, obviously on campuses that's going through, which to me seems a little connected to the Jewish Virtual Library, which is very interesting because it talks about Israel, it talks about anti-Zionism, it talks about Jewish history. I'm curious what spawned that as a major project for your organization. What made you want to do the Jewish Virtual Library?
Well, back in 1997, most of us were just discovering this thing called the World Wide Web, and organizations started to make websites. And one day I was asking a research assistant of mine to look up something, and they typed furiously in the computer for about 5 minutes and told me there was no information. And it didn't even occur to them to look behind them at these bookshelves full of books or to pick up a telephone. And I realized that students from that point on were going to rely on their computers and the internet for information. And back in 1997, for those who may remember that far back, if you wanted to know something about Israel, there was very little there. It was hard to find, and it wasn't very good. And so I decided I wanted students to be able to find the answers they had to questions about Israel. And I took a book I wrote originally when I was at APAC, but then took over at ACE called Myths and Facts about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I basically took the facts about Israel out and put them on the website. Then I realized shortly thereafter that if a student was interested in the Holocaust or in anti-Semitism or in Judaism in general, the same problem. There was very little on the web at the time. It was hard to find. It wasn't very good. So I basically created a monster for myself of deciding that I wanted to have the answer to every question that a Jewish student or any other student might ask about anything from anti-Semitism to Zionism. And so since then, we've been trying to create a compendium of material that allows students to get the answers they want in one place. So we've got something like 25,000 entries now. We have 500,000 people who visit every month from more than 200 countries. And what we also tried to do was not reinvent the wheel. That is, I didn't write 25,000 articles on everything about Jewish history. So we had the philosophy of trying to find the best material we could and ask for permission to use it on our website. And fortunately, most organizations have been very generous about sharing, and we always link back to them, so we feel like we're also promoting their resources.
Mm-hmm.
And that made us a one-stop shop, because one of the other things about the internet back in those old days was that most of the historical kinds of websites were portals. That is, they'd just be a collection of links.
Right.
So that if you wanted to learn something, you would click to 15 different websites to get the same amount of information. And I wanted you to just be able to find it, at least to begin with, at my site. And if you wanted to go beyond that, you can always do more research.
It's a very easy to read website. I've explored it a couple of times myself. Just, click the tab, click on it, it gives the information right away. You don't have to go through a million portals. I'm curious, in regards to so much discussion these days in regards to, factual information, where resources come from, things like that. I'm curious, when you set out, and even today, because I'm sure things get updated all the time because it's obviously a portal. I mean, not a portal, it's a virtual library. Was there specific standards and practices you used for the specific type of scholarly research you wanted to use? In other words, when you put in factual information about, let's say, anti-Semitism, Israel, is there specific ways that you've examined of, okay, this is the type of resource we want to use, or this is the type of resource we would never use?
Well, that's very important, because without credibility, our site would be useless.
Right.
And because it has so much credibility, it was really one of the few resources for a long time, and maybe even today, that teachers would allow their students to cite. And because of my academic background, it was always very important to me that we had the best information we could find, scholarly as much as possible, but I didn't want it to be inaccessible. So the idea was to be like an encyclopedia, that it would be relatively short entries that would give you the basics about a particular subject. And so I would try to find sources that were as credible as could be, whether it was on the Holocaust, where you could go to Yad Vashem or the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, or whatever the resource might be, the ADL for anti-Semitism. The other thing, as an academic, I am very interested in primary sources. So as much as possible, I'd like to get original documents. So for example, right now I'm in the process of curating a collection of CIA documents from 47 to 49, looking at what the CIA and State Department was saying about the partition plan for Israel and the war. And those I find particularly interesting, and they also give the website, I think, even more scholarly and research-oriented credibility.
So I'm curious in regards to, because again, you said you wanted the website to be an area where people could get direct access to factual information. You mentioned obviously Israel, you mentioned anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, which is covered in the website. I'm curious in regards to myths and facts, was there a specific, like what made you decide to specifically have a section on myths and facts when it came to Israel and just different types of Jewish knowledge? So, because that's a very interesting in itself subject line to anybody who looks at the website and goes, what's this?
Well, Myths and Facts has actually been around since around 1960, when the original director, founder of APAC started the publication, because there was this ongoing propaganda against Israel, and most people didn't have the background or knowledge to be able to know what the facts were about whatever that particular issue may be. And it continues to this day, almost a daily basis. You get some new myth or propaganda coming out about what Israel is doing. Just for example, this week there was this allegation that Israel had shot some innocent Palestinian who in fact was trying to run over soldiers at the checkpoint and was shot as a result of that. But just as with the rest of the website, when I started Myths and Facts back at APAC in '93, I believe, it didn't have footnotes. And so I added footnotes to be sure that you could show that there was a source for everything that was in the book. And so Myths and Facts we put online, again, because it's such a important resource for people who want to be able to find out what the facts are when these various myths come. And some of them are evergreens that come up all the time about how the Palestinians became refugees, for example, or you have the issue that's at the forefront of people's minds at the moment, the application of sovereignty to the West Bank. So a lot of questions about settlements and the history of settlements, whether they are obstacle to peace or whether they're illegal. All of that's very important if you want to be knowledgeable about Middle East affairs, and especially about Israel. So again, it's on the website and it is footnoted and documented so that it's just as accurate and credible as any of the other entries.
So I'm curious if you could actually just switch a little bit, but you mentioned some of your book writing actually, and I'd be curious if you could tell us a little bit about some of the types of books you've written, and obviously what there seems to obviously be some common themes going on in our conversation about areas that interest you, but I'm curious for those who haven't read your books, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, my first book was my PhD dissertation, which was basically looking at whether the pro-Israel community has any influence on U.S. Middle East policy. And unlike most research on that topic, I had some qualitative measures for it. So it wasn't just sort of the subjective opinions that you typically get from people like Walton Mearsheimer, who wrote a whole book that was full of nonsense. Since then, I've written about a number of different topics depending on what interests me. The next book, I was particularly interested when I learned about American soldiers who were sent to a concentration camp. And I subsequently did a lot of research and discovered that American civilians and some POWs were sent to concentration camps. That was a big shock, but perhaps even more shocking was to find out that the US government treated Americans much the way they treated European Jews and did little or nothing to save them. So that book, Forgotten Victims, The Abandonment of Americans in Hitler's Camps, was my next book. I also wrote a book on Ethiopian Jews. Again, I was interested in the subject of what took so long to rescue the Ethiopian Jews. What was the reason? So From Tragedy to Triumph was a book I wrote about that. And I wrote several books related to the Holocaust. I wrote one on Kristallnacht that looked at various personal recollections of that 48-hour period. I did a couple of books on general things about the Holocaust and Nuremberg trials. Then more recently, I wrote a book about the Arab lobby, because nobody seemed to pay any attention to the fact that it wasn't just people who were pro-Israel who were trying to influence our government. There was a whole very sophisticated lobby trying to influence the government either to help the Arab states or to hurt Israel. That book's called The Arab Lobby. I did another one where I was interested in the negative impact of radical Islam and its targeting of Jews around the world. So that was another interesting book. And then probably my most enjoyable book was writing a novel about what happened to Tevye and his family after they left Anatevka. It's called After Anatevka, Tevye in Palestine, because Shalom Aleichem actually wrote a story called Tevye in Palestine, but in the story, Tevye never makes it. But I thought it would be interesting to imagine what it would have been like if Tevye had taken his family to Palestine, and I tried to tell the story of the birth of Israel through the eyes of Tevye and his family.
Interesting. So sounds very fascinating. I mean, all the books sound very fascinating, but the idea of thinking of Tevye and what he would have been like in that situation, especially thinking of the play, is deeply fascinating. So, in regards to not only yourself, but obviously with ACE, with the virtual library, is there any upcoming projects that you're working on, or anything whoever is watching, should be looking out for?
Well, I think it's mostly at this point updating the library all the time, updating myths and facts on pretty much a weekly basis. We have a weekly newsletter or basically an email that you can sign up for on the website, which usually will have a myth and fact. It will have an article that I may have written recently and a couple of examples of new entries in the library, a video,
Hmm.
and a quiz on your knowledge about Israel and the Holocaust. Those are the main things. And then there's ongoing work in fighting BDS. Prior to our current situation, I gave a lot of lectures. I would give workshops on campuses. I would speak in communities and synagogues and all the rest, give courses on various aspects of Jewish history and Israel advocacy. And focus, for obvious reasons, has been the boycott efforts and its impact, or in some cases, lack of impact. One of the things I do is I keep a hashtag BDS fail, where I like to highlight all the failures of the movement to try to convince either campuses or governments or companies to boycott Israel, because it's been a colossal failure overall. And I pay a lot of close attention, especially to what goes on college campuses. So we have a website called stopbds.com, which was really designed especially for students and campus professionals. We called it a cookbook with recipes for how to deal with the BDS issue.
Mm.
And in the Jewish Virtual Library, we have a lot of material about the BDS movement. I have a list, for example, of performers who have done concerts in Israel to counter this notion that there are all of these performers who are boycotting Israel as a result of the BDS movement.
Mm.
And so the overall effort is to just educate people so that they can make more informed decisions and to understand the Jewish history, politics, and culture that they may not otherwise have learned in school or get from the media or anywhere else.
Mm. So, because of the coronavirus, I mean, obviously you're able to, online from the safety of your own home, update the website and things like that. But you were mentioning, you give lectures, things like that. Are you doing kind of a Zoom equivalent of that, or is everything kind of standstill at the moment?
Mostly standstill at the moment. This is a slow period anyway. Usually there's not a lot going on during the summer, but I'm thinking about what can be done in terms of whether Zoom lectures will be something that makes sense. I have a couple of lectures scheduled down in Florida Atlantic University. I don't know if those are going to be via Zoom or some other method at this point, but we'll see. I'm not sure how interesting it is to listen to me over Zoom. This will be a test, and we'll look into it, I think, over the coming months.
So, if anyone wants to learn kind of more about, obviously, you have the website, if you can just obviously state the name of it again. But if anyone wants to find more information about your books or the things that currently ACE and the Jewish Virtual Library are working on, what are the best resources for them?
The best place is jewishvirtuallibrary.org. Pretty much everything is there. If you want to learn more about my work and my books and articles, I write pretty regularly in places like the Algemeiner and Times of Israel. These publications and books are all on my personal website, mitchellbard.com.
All right. Well, everyone, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. And of course, I want to thank Dr. Mitchell Bard for your time and talking to us about these organizations that you are obviously created, founding, part of, and also these books that you've worked on over the years that anyone could, I assume, be able to find on Amazon or any of their local stores, I would think.
They should all be on Amazon, yes.
Very good. So I want to thank you so much for being with us today and speaking with us. For everyone out there, I want you to stay safe, stay healthy, and have a wonderful day. Dr. Bard, thank you so much for having us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.